Okay, shift gears with me because we are moving from a place where, you know what, in some ways we're shifting gears, but we're not, because that last picture that had the soldiers holding up their cookies, some of those are stationed in places that actually aren't too far from the biblical stories that we've been talking about this month. The stories of Exodus and Moses and where he leads the people. And if you'll go back to the beginning of the month, I'm going to kind of walk you through where we've been briefly. The first Sunday of this kind of series was when Moses encountered God and his voice out way beyond the wilderness in a burning bush. You remember, and the bush is not consumed, but the call comes to Moses where God says to him, I want you to go and I want you to bring deliverance to my people who are slaves in Egypt. And part of what we talked about that Sunday were these 5 things that God in some ways in that story is saying, listen to me, revere me, obey me, trust me, remember me. Now, I'm not going to put this slide up again, but I want you to maybe remember those things, because even as we get to the scripture reading for this week, it's crazy to me. Those 5 things still very much apply. Are we listening? Are we revering? Are we obeying, trusting, and remembering? And then that took us to the next week where the story was way advanced in Moses' history. He had in fact gone to Egypt and he had brought the people out of Egyptian slavery. Pharaoh had told them to go. But then, the story gets to this place where Moses and all the people of Israel encamped, and they have the pursuing Egyptian army and their chariots at their back, and all they see in front of them is the sea. And the famous story of God working through Moses to part that sea so the Israelites could walk through on dry ground and the Egyptian army would be swallowed up. And the idea there that we pulled away from was that when God told Moses and the people to go, all they saw was water, that they didn't see the path yet. And that there are times in our lives where God is saying, go forward and trust me to provide the path. And sometimes he'll provide it when we can't even see it. He did that for them and spread the waters wide. And then last week, we went to the other side of the sea with them as they were starting to wander in the wilderness a bit, and God promised to provide for them there. But this idea that he'll provide enough, and he'll make this weird stuff fall from the sky, and it's called manna, and it'll be enough to live on, but it'll be just enough sometimes. And it kind of called into question our culture of excess and the way that we, even just as human beings, that so often enough is never enough, and we always need more. We always go after more rather than settling into and being content with what God's given, the enoughness of God and his provision. So that kind of catches you up to where we are. And then this week we continue with the people as they leave that place of enough and the provision in the wilderness. They're still wandering. Now, y'all, you need to remember that when we say, especially in Exodus, wandering in the wilderness. Now, I grew up in North Georgia, so I think wilderness, and its images come to mind of like the Pisgah National Forest or going up toward the Nantahala or Clayton and all that area, and like when you get into some of that thick mountainous terrain and trees everywhere and roaring rivers running through it. Remember that is, the wilderness that these folks were wandering in looked way more like what we might think of Arizona and southern Utah. Whole lot of red rocks, or maybe more like the moon, or Mars. Lots of red rock, lots of red dust, lots of red cliffs, lots of dirt. That was the wilderness, okay? So they've been wandering in this wilderness for a while, and it brings us to this story that's in the 32nd chapter of Exodus, and I'm going to read it and invite you to just read along with me. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain. Now, Moses was not just on a hike. Moses literally, as we're reading this, Moses had been spending time with God on the mountain. God had given instruction, don't let the other people come up, okay? So it wasn't like Moses said, see ya, I'm gone, I'll come back when I feel like it. God was in the mix here, okay? So the mountain was a mountain where Moses was having a very important meeting with God. So he had delayed to come down from the mountain. The people gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother, who was kind of put in charge while Moses was gone, right? And said to him, this is the people talking, come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Aaron said to them, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord. They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, now back on the mountain, Lord said to Moses, go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. The Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation. But Moses implored the Lord his God, and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn your fierce wrath. Change your mind. Do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people. Some rules that God can give that can help us lead a life that's more faithful and looks more like who God wants us to be. Certain rules that are important to follow. Have y'all ever had an animal that you've trained to follow some rules? Any of y'all ever had children that you've tried to train? Try to train? I remember when we took our dog to get some training, and the trainer said that in that moment, part of what you were trying to reinforce wasn't even necessarily the specific action that you were calling for. You were trying to reinforce that it was crucial for the animal to listen to you. And then the specifics follow. If they're listening, then you can give them instruction. If they're not listening, doesn't matter what instruction you give them. Make sense? So the umbrella truth is listen, revere, obey, trust. Do you see how that comes back? The umbrella message is it's important to listen to the rules. I came across a video that I just want us to watch. That's maybe a real world example of trying to follow the rules and maybe getting it right, maybe not. Here we go.
Wait, no. No. Hayes, don't do it. No. Don't do it. No. Don't do it. Don't do it. No. 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 Don't even think of no. Don't even think about no. 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 No.
Okay, apart from that, having like the cutest little kid ever, I could almost give a benediction right now and say, we treat God like that. Don't treat God like that. If that's what you remember, that's kind of a good thing to remember. There are times where God is trying to reinforce this idea of listen to my voice, because that seems to be part of what's in play there, is that it's important that there's this little cup of water, but probably what's more important is, are you listening? And in our faith and our relationship with God, so often it's all these individual actions we think are so important, and maybe bigger than any of them is God saying, are you listening? And so often, I know it's true for me, we want to do what that kid was doing, and then we swing back, and I'm going to move toward. Oh, no, I'm going to move. And we do that. And I think in all of it, God is saying, listen to me. and I will guide all the rest of the specifics. But if you're not listening to me, it doesn't matter how many specifics I give you. You've got to listen first. You've got to be open and aware of my presence that will lead you and guide you. And part of the way God does that, I think, is he does give us some rules to follow. There are certain rules in the Old Testament that we shouldn't just dismiss. Christ came and said, I haven't come to abolish the law. I've come to perfect it, fulfill it, complete it. I've come to make it exactly what God wanted it to be. The lawyer asked Jesus, what is the most important law? And Jesus didn't respond to him by saying, well, there aren't any rules that are important, did he? He said the highest is love the Lord your God, and the second like to it is love your neighbor as you love yourself. So Jesus even operated with this idea and sense that there are rules that God has put in place that are critically important for us to listen to. That word rule is something that some of us bristle at a little bit, some of us who don't love the thought of a bunch of rules. But think about it. Our lives would be chaos if it weren't for rules. We abide by rules. We find meaning in life in rules. We find comfort and security in rules. Aren't we glad that when we go from this place and get in our cars, that the people governing us didn't just say, yeah, drive wherever you feel like. I mean, make it a bumper car thing. I don't care. We're not going to put lanes. We're not going to stripe any roadways. We're not going to have speed limits. Drive on the right or left. Heck, drive right in the center. We don't care. Drive down the median. It doesn't. Aren't we glad that that's not the case? Because rules keep us safe sometimes. They form the boundaries of our lives. And so I think with God, it's also true. God gives us these rules, but yet some of us can sometimes be, and we probably know people who have this notion that rules are meant to be. Some of y'all spoke that kind of loudly and confidently. We'll have a prayer service for you after the worship. Rules are meant to be broken, and some people function in that way sometimes. Sometimes with their whole lives, sometimes in little elements of it. As an illustration, I was thinking back on this, and I remember when I was, I don't know how old I was, maybe 7 or 8. I had an older brother that was 7 years older than me, and I had finally gotten to a point, 7 years is a lot of age difference, and so as you're growing up, sometimes it's hard to find commonality when you're siblings and you have that much time between you. And so I'd finally gotten to the point where, even when it comes to games, it's the reason I ask about what games did you play growing up. One of the things that we found that we could play pretty easily together was the card game Uno. You know that you are familiar with this game? The game Uno. And even though I was only 7 or 8, we would sometimes, we didn't play it all the time, but it was kind of a go-to if we were bored and together. And so probably months went by of us playing, and at some point, my world crashed down in front of me. My spiritual compass was broken, and I found that it was my brother that did it. Because here's what happened. Some light in my mind and soul dawned, and I said, I never win. That is disproportionate. Something is amiss. It can't be. Because y'all know, some of Uno is just chance, right? I mean, what cards you're dealt, and there is some strategy, but it's also a great deal of chance. And so I had matured intellectually to the level where I realized chance can't be 100% in his favor. That doesn't make any sense. And so I challenged myself. I commissioned myself. I'm going to watch closely this brother of mine. And I noticed that as we were playing, he would very subtly and skillfully, at times where it was very carefully and craftily done, he would play 2 or 3 cards at the same time. Someone in the room should go, because that's terrible. You don't do that in cards, right? And what he would do, I watched, and as he would kind of fan out the cards in front of him and shuffle them and do all that and kind of distracting, and then I noticed that he would take the 2 or 3 cards, but make sure that they were right on top of one another. And he would take it as if they were one, and he would lay it down on the pile with his thumb in the middle, so that they didn't fan out when he laid them down, and then pull his hand back. Your move. every sense of right and wrong shattered. It was one of those where it was like, it wasn't so much that he was winning all the time. What really bugged me at that point was that he was doing it by breaking the rules that set the whole foundation of the game. So it was kind of like, what's the point of even playing the game if we're not going to abide by the rules, right? Even in games, it's the rules that give the boundaries for how it's to be played. My guess is that there are a lot of y'all that really don't have any interest in playing a game to which the rules are made up as you go. Does that sound like a lot of fun? If we said, after worship, everybody stay in here, we're going to play a game called Toast. Well, Brad, what's this game called Toast? I'm not sure. We're going to just start and make it up as we go. I've got better things to do. That doesn't sound like much fun. It sounds frustrating. It sounds irritating. Now, there are a few of y'all in the room that might have lit up and said, oh, I want to play this game. You're the entrepreneurs. You know, you're the people who I don't care about the risk. We're going to go for it. We'll make it up. It'll be to our favor. We'll work it out. It's going to be good. Those are the visionaries. The rest of us think that just sounds miserable. A game is supposed to be played with rules. And the thought that I have in all of this is that the faith world that God creates for us is kind of the same way. And sometimes what we do, wittingly or unwittingly, is we sometimes look at God and say, God, I know that you designed the game and you made the rules, and you being the designer of the game must have known the rules better than we do that should be in play. But you know what? There's some times that I don't like your rules, so I'm going to make it up as we go. I'm going to dismiss your rules because they don't suit me right now. I'm going to, God, play 2 or 3 cards at a time because it might help me win the game a little better. And we make it up as we go, and we dismiss the rules that God's put in place to keep us safe, to shape us to be who God wants us to be. Don't do that. So the umbrella idea, it seems, in all these stories is listen to God. Be listening for God. And then it's kind of like there's things that God does, and we listen for individual circumstances. And in this particular story, one of the ways that God said, listen to me, is he said, don't worship people other than me. Don't worship idols. Don't be drawn away from me. Don't let your attention get distracted from following me. To do that, you've got to listen to me. So listen to me is at the top. And then in this particular case, don't have idols. Don't form them in front of you. And what do the people do? They say, well, God, that's great and all, but I don't like your rules. They're not working for me right now. I'm going to create my own. And here's the thing. I think sometimes God puts those rules in place for us, those guides in our lives, because he knows that they're places that we're weak. Even when Jesus was questioned, and he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, spirit. I don't think Jesus would need to put a rule in place that we were automatically, naturally inclined to do. Does that make sense? I don't have to come to you every morning and say, ooh, sissy, don't remember, you got to breathe air today. Right? Mark, don't breathe water today. Breathe air today. You don't have to be reminded. You don't have to have a rule to do something that you're automatically, naturally inclined to do. So sometimes the rules of God are meant to meet us where we're weak. Does that make sense? Where we have a propensity to not be that way. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor. I sometimes have a propensity to not love the Lord my God with all. Do you? So I need a rule to remind me. I sometimes have a propensity to not love my neighbor as myself. Do you? I sometimes have a propensity to worship other things and situations or successes. Do you? I sometimes have a propensity. You get what I'm going with. So are we listening in these specific things? Well, one thing that comes up in this story as I read it from Exodus is that those weaknesses that God knows about, we see on display. When God says, don't worship an idol, and then we see as the people do that, we see some specific sort of weaknesses and flaws. And I want to go through these for just a minute. And as we go through them, as a way of not letting any of us off the hook who might say, those terrible people of Israel, how could they be so faithless? I want you to read those and think, does that ever sound like you? We find that the people were impatient. We find that the people were not good at surrendering control. Ouch. Anybody in the room? We find that the people sometimes say one thing and then they do another. And then we find that the leader, in this case Aaron, standing in for Moses, cared too much about making the people around him happy. As I look at that list, I think, gosh, that sometimes sounds a lot like me. And so I don't need to throw stones at the people of Israel. I need to see what was the rule intending to do for the people to get over these motivations that can so often lead us. So let's go through those a little bit one at a time. The people are impatient. The scripture says that God in his interaction with Moses even says they are a stiff-necked people. That's not something we throw around a whole lot, but I looked it up. Another word that can be used there is obstinate. Just dug in, and once they've made up their mind, even though it may be the worst idea on the planet, unswerving, unwavering, stubborn, and some might say hard-headed, stiff-necked people. Impatient. Once they've set their minds to doing something different, then doggone it, that's the new way it's going to be. We're going to make up the rule as we go, and it doesn't matter. There's some irony in this story too, because even though we read from chapter 32, you know, I mentioned it says that Moses was on the mountain, and that's part of why the people did this whole idol, and we need something, and make a calf and all that stuff. Well, this wasn't the first time that Moses had been up on the mountain. He had been up on the mountain before. If you go back to Exodus chapter 20, Moses is on the mountain with God, and God delivers rules for living faithfully. You'll find in chapter 20 of Exodus, the 10 Commandments, and other kind of rules for faithful living as people of God in a faithful community. And then Moses brought those to the people. He came down from the mountain, told the people all that God had told him, and the people say this kills me. The people say, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses, this is good. We listen, and we shall follow. And then Moses goes back up the mountain to continue to confer with God. So the people aren't in the dark. It's not like Moses just disappears and what's he doing? The people know what's going on. And it's in that situation, while Moses is on the mountain, that the people say, we've got to have a God. Aaron fashioned one for us. Let's make it up ourselves. Let's make some rules. And the irony, do you know in that moment when Moses is on the mountain with God, what they're discussing? God is giving Moses instructions for how to worship him. Think about that contrast. As God is giving Moses instructions, here's how you worship me. Down in the valley below, the people are figuring out their own worship style and their own worship subject, happening at the same time. The people are impatient. They just couldn't deal with waiting for the voice of God to reveal to them what they should be. Are you ever impatient? I thought about this, and this is a little crass, but in some ways, if we made a comparison, it would almost be like if my wife Erica said, you know what, I want to strengthen our marriage, and I want to get all the tools I can, and so I'm going to go, if I'm Erica, and there's this week-long marriage enrichment retreat for wives, and I'm going to go to it to just get all the tools I can to strengthen it, making it as good as I can. And I know she's going. And this situation, it would almost be like if she goes on that, and while she's away for that week, I have a date with a different woman every night of the week. That's pretty, isn't it? Moses is with the one who created the game, getting the rules, and the people are saying those rules don't apply to us. We want to be unfaithful to those. They were impatient. It says the people aren't good at surrendering control. Oh man, are you? That is not an easy thing. And so I think part of the whole idea, worship no other gods but me, that God gives us is because God knows surrendering control is one of the hardest things that many of us ever do. But yet, in our life of faith, it's one of the most critical things. I kind of look at it as an option between self-determinism and surrender. Which is it going to be? The people in this moment decided self-determinism was better, when if they had just been willing and able to surrender some control, we might all be in better shape. God wants us all the time and is drawing us to this posture of surrender as we come before him. God, I'm not all that I think I am. I can't control half that I think I can. I surrender to you. It says to us that the people say one thing. In other words, yeah, we'll do it. This is good, and we'll obey. And then they end up doing another. Shows us the human propensity to not make good on our pledges and our vows. And I'm going to say a couple things that I don't mean to be heavy-handed, but just we don't need to look any further than ourselves for illustrations of this. An easy target for me, if you would, is this idea of we pledge and we vow, but do we live up to it? Church membership is an interesting thing, and I'm preaching to the choir. Y'all are here. A lot of y'all that sit in these chairs are members of this church and stood before a body and said, we will support it with our prayers, our presence, our gifts, our service, our witness. We're going to have Neil and Heather come later, and they're going to say that to us this morning. Many of y'all said that. You know that this church has a membership between 5,000 and 6,000 people. Do you know the last time we had 5,000 in worship? That'd be never. Do we make good on our pledges and our vows? You've seen probably the statistics, and I don't mean this to, if you're in the room and you're divorced, this isn't a bash at you, it's just a statistic, but marriage is based on vows. Can I get a witness? And the statistics are that within the Christian community, divorce rates are at least even with non-Christians and many times higher. Are we a people that are prone to saying one thing and then doing another? Now, maybe that's over a long period of time, but we need to be cautioned on, do our words mean what we say they mean? Are we really committed to following through when we make a pledge or a vow to anyone, to someone, most of all to God? Will we follow through? And then the last thing, well, you know what, hang on, before I go on, it's so critical, this idea, sorry, Denise, saying one thing and then doing another. It's interesting to me that that what it says, after the idol was fashioned and the people began to worship it, it's a really slippery slope at that point. Because almost immediately it says that they began to feast and eat and drink and revel. And so it's like that first step toward disobedience so often is the critical one. I mean, any of you all who know anything about the world of addiction and the danger of the word relapse, that one decision, and unfaithfulness is like that. And going against our vow is like that. That first step is so often the hardest. And once you've made that step, oh, you know what? These new rules are treating me pretty good. Here, have another drink. Here, let's do what we want to do. Here, we don't need to pay attention to all that. That's just rules. Let's make our own. Now, the last thing on here, the leader cares too much about making the people around him happy. Y'all, I'm a pleaser. When you take those personality tests, I sit on that side of the spectrum. That I hate being in leadership in a room where someone leaves really unhappy with a decision. I tend to push for consensus. I tend to try and unearth and find the reasons where people have, issues with topics and things like that. And so this one makes me bristle a little bit because I like making people happy too. But in this moment, Aaron does that critical thing of he lets the voices of the people around him outweigh the voice of God. And so I just want to encourage you, all of us have some capacity of leadership. It may be in your home. No, let me back up. It is in your home. I don't care who you are in that home. You have a capacity of leadership in your family. You have a capacity of leadership at school, on a team, at work. Are you allowing the voices of those others to cause you to do things that just placate them? And now this is important. I'm not saying just on any old decision, but if you feel like God is trying to speak to you in one way and those voices pull you in another way, whose voices are you allowing to be louder? Whose voices are you turning toward to get full ear of? You turning toward God? You're turning toward the people. Don't do that. That's part of what this story says to me. Number one, above all things, listen for God. Listen for God to make the rules and trust that the rules are for your health and benefit and protection. And then seek to follow through. So, At one point in the story, the people kind of proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel." If someone walked into this space right now and walked right down here to the middle and stood around and said, "These are your gods, O Alpharetta, Milton, Roswell, Johns Creek, Crabapple, Cumming, probably more. These are your gods." If we saw them on display, what would we see? Number one, would they be plural? Or would some of us be able to look and say, "No, that is my God. And it's a God that created the world. And it's a God that leads and guides his people. And it's a God that sent Jesus to provide for every need that we have and forgive us of our sin. And it's a God who draws me toward him." What would you see? These are your gods. I'm going to invite the band back up. And we're going to kind of close this time of worship by me just encouraging you to think about that. These are your gods, or would it be for you, this is your God? We're going to sing a little bit more of the song, "Come to the Altar." And this isn't really an altar, although I guess it could be. And so we're going to stand and sing. And I don't know, some of y'all this morning may even be led to come and kneel. I don't want to keep that from you. And if you're led to do that and kind of say, "God, I have let many other things take your place. And I want to give your place back to you." And even if you don't come up here, as we sing it, I invite you in your heart and the posture of your mind and your spirit to be kneeling before God, an altar, like, I've let other things take your place. Did you notice what Aaron made the idol out of? They're surrounded by rocks and stones and dust and dirt, things that were outside of the people. He didn't make the idol out of any of that stuff. The people came from among them. The idol came from within them. The idol was them. Those things that helped to define who they were became the idol. So sometimes the idol can be playing in your own playground, right there among you, waiting for a moment. Surrender. God, forgive us for the idols that we let take your place. Draw us closer.